Good morning, and thank you everyone for attending this call with Tim Hunt, the CEO of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, or ARM. I'm Gula Lifshitz, one of the senior biotech research analysts at Chardon. And before we get started, our compliance team has asked us to read the statement. Our participant has attested and agreed that they will not share or discuss any material, non-public or confidential information that they're aware of. And a recording of this call will be available to clients after the event. During the call, if anyone in the audience would like to submit a question, please type it into the question box and we'll try to ask it on your behalf. All right, so Tim, thank you again for joining us today. Before we get into the questions, could you share your background with the audience and then give us a brief overview of ARM and its mission?
Yeah, you bet. And thanks, Gula. It's great to be here. So I've been with the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine for 2.5 years. So we're a nonprofit association headquartered in Washington, D.C. Got a team of about 28 people, 2 over in Europe, the rest are in the U.S. It's an association made up of over 400 members. So those are anything from small private biotech companies to public biotech companies to some of the large pharmaceutical companies. All the kind of common thing, that the thread that keeps us all together is we're exclusively focused on cell therapy, gene editing. We do a little bit of tissue repair as well. We've got a few dozen patient organizations, mostly rare disease patient organizations that are members, a number of the big academic medical centers like Penn and the Mayo Clinic. They're also members, and then a lot of the strategic suppliers, tools companies, CDMOs, CROs, other tech companies that are focused on cell and gene therapy. We do 2 big conferences a year. We've got a big meeting coming up in Rome in mid-April that we're looking forward to. That's our big European meeting. Get about 500 to 600 people there. And we do a big meeting, our meeting on the Mesa out in Arizona every year. That'll draw about a couple thousand people. And so lots of panels and things like that. We do traditional lobbying in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels, and a number of other things. We produce data on the sector, so we can talk more about that if it's helpful, but that's a quickie snapshot. Like I said, I've been at ARM for 2.5 years. I've got about 25 years in the biotech industry, going back to when I was a wee one, my early days at what was then Glaxo Wellcome, and then Biogen IDEC, which is now Biogen again. I was there for about 9 years. I worked at Cubist Pharmaceuticals, Editas Medicine, and then immuno-oncology company Xilio before taking the role here. Early in my career, I was in Washington, D.C. for a number of years. So I got kind of bit by the political bug a little bit. I was a history and philosophy major at Boston College. I'm a reformed lawyer after that. Father, a couple kids. And I've got a 19-year-old with a rare disorder called Dandy Walker syndrome, which is a rare neurological disorder. So, I've got some clear alignment and a lot of time and empathy for those in the rare disease community, and that's a big part of some of the stuff we do.
I see. So as someone who's been in the rare disease community and the genetic medicines world for some time, even before your role at ARM, can you talk at a high level how you characterize the cell and gene therapy or broader genetic medicines space today and its evolution over the past several years, and how you feel that projecting forward?
Yeah. So definitely it's evolved a lot in the last few years. I mean, some of the things we're talking about today, it's really interesting. Like, we were sort of thinking about them when I was at Editas Medicine, or they were interesting ideas, and now they're like really put into practice. So I'd say that it's been a transformative sort of 5 to 7 years, I think, for sure, decade without question. And I think, look, there are some clear challenges in the cell and gene therapy space. We can talk about that definitely. But there's also a lot of great opportunities that are very clear and compelling, 100%. And, the science is charging forward. I think that's probably the most important thing. It's impressive, right? We can do more now than ever. There's lots of technology today that's being put into the clinic. The products are getting approved. But also there's a lot of great opportunity into the future, right? Cell therapies, in vivo CAR Ts, cell therapies for autoimmune disorders, for solid tumors, right? Huge markets. And then a lot of impressive work with in vivo gene editing and on and on and on, right? So I think it's really it's a transformative time. There are definitely some challenges, but I would, in balance, I think the opportunities are pretty immense. The other thing is, you have like this is kind of a golden era with the regulators, the FDA, the EMA, the MHRA, right? Like a few years ago, you wind the clock back 2, 3 years ago, there were some challenges with the FDA. They did a major shakeup in the place. Peter Marks, I give him a lot of credit. Built the super office, the OTP, hired Nicole Verdun. She's fantastic. We get incredibly strong feedback on her and her team, on how active they are, how they understand the science. They've hired a lot of people. We can get more into the Trump administration and all that, because I know there's certainly that's a question mark in a lot of people's minds. But so I think but when you step back and look at it from the science perspective, the regulators are in a very good place. Emer Cook is coming to our meeting in Rome in a few weeks. I mean, they're good, right? The commercial opportunities, I think, are also a good thing to talk about. They are vast and impressive. When you look at the data, there's a bunch of examples where there's been some headwinds and some specific areas. And while the products aren't perfect, for sure, this generation of technology is not perfect. But when talk to the patients, right? You hear some incredibly compelling stories. So it's the impact on patients is impressive.
The past few years have been pretty challenging for the field. Investors have raised some concerns about cell and gene therapy commercialization models. We've seen some discontinuation of some pharma collaborations, for example, Pfizer's hemophilia collaborations and other factors. So maybe let's jump to the elephants in the room. From your conversations with folks in the space, what are the major factors driving the negative sentiment? Let's kind of get through them one by one and talk about that.
Yeah, great. I mean, we can put it all on the table because there are a few things there for sure, as you know. So I think, look, as I touched on, right, this generation of technology with cell and gene therapy can be transformative for patients, but at the same time, I think nobody says these products are perfect, right? Some, depending on the product, they could have some safety challenges here or there. They can have some efficacy challenges, durability questions, complex dosing regimens, right? There's some obvious things that I think are there. Cost of goods is still not, when you look at the field, is not where we want it to be. I think it's going to get much better, but it's not, but still they're high. The commercial model, as you know, people have pointed to some challenges in hemophilia because of competition, right? Sickle cell disease because of the complex regimen at times, right? Ultra rare disorders, right? The questions are they really built for a one-time treatment? Is that a viable commercial model by itself, right? Payers in Europe, right? US and Europe, question marks. I think there's a very good story actually in there, and it's a lot better than when you dig into it. It's a lot better than things were even 2 to 3 years ago, as real products are now going through real systems, especially health technology assessment bodies over in Europe, right? I think it's a big myth. Certainly that we saw the Pfizer news with hemophilia, but there's this bigger, even before that, there's this bigger kind of narrative that, well, big pharma is not really interested in this space. Not true. We can talk about that more. And then, the Trump administration is an X factor for lots of industries right now, not just biotechnology, but there's question marks out there that doesn't necessarily help all the time. And then probably lastly, there's a bigger downdraft that everybody in biotech is feeling for the last 3 years. And we haven't been immune to that. In fact, we've been even more exposed in many ways. And so the data backs that up. It's been a tough few years, right? So you could just say, throw in the towel, call it, there's no hope. Let's all just take our marbles and go home. Or, you kind of look at it a little bit differently. And I think the data tell a pretty good story. But that to start are sort of the, are some of the headwinds that we've been facing. I'm happy to unpack.
Yeah, so let's kind of unpack each of those. I mean, maybe I'll start with the commercialization model and maybe starting with the addressable market question. And we talked about a lot of these the programs in the genetic medicine space target rare disease, obviously not huge populations. Is it feasible to develop therapies for rare diseases and still drive commercial success there?
Yeah, right. It comes up. It's definitely come up. And I think, as I mentioned, the things I hear the most are those three areas, right? People point to sickle cell, hemophilia, and the ultra rare market typically, right? And so if you unpack those, right? Sickle cell is a complex market, right? I don't think people that have followed the sickle cell market for a few years are surprised to hear that. These regimens are for individual patients can be seriously transformative, but they're right now they're reserved for kind of the roughest folks, right? Those patients can consume $4 to $6 million in healthcare costs over a lifetime. You get a stroke, maybe you get another stroke. Second time, you might be dead, right? These are really, really tough cases. So your average sickle cell patient lives to probably 45 to 55. These are the ones that are in rough shape. But the market's going to take time probably to unpack. And I think the Vertex CRISPR guys have been pretty realistic about that. Probably the Bluebird team at some level as well, but complex, right? There's other technologies coming. Probably the ultimate solution is going to be in vivo regimens, but that will take some years. Beam's obviously working on their regimen that wouldn't have the exposure to chemotherapy. So there's potential there, right? The hemophilia markets, that's one where there's a lot of, I mean, I remember going back years ago, hemophilia has always been a tough market, right? There's a lot of big, successful, entrenched players in there. It's a complex market, but it's a real market. And CSL Behring's now working through that as is BioMarin, right? But they're going to, the same thing, they're going to probably take a little bit of time. And then the ultra orphan markets, I think those have always, for those of us that have been in them over the years, they've always been small. And you've got to think about if you're only going to see a patient once, what's the real market opportunity? But a lot of companies, I think, have in the past and will continue to look at them as, look, these are strategic areas where we should play to prove our capabilities, show the technology works. Can we deliver the gene? Can we make the edit? How do we think about delivery in general, right? So, and then they look at larger markets, follow-on markets, right? So Rocket's a good example, right? A couple of small markets and now looking at a much larger market like Danon disease, right? So that's sort of some of the bigger challenges you hear. But if you step back too, I think, and you look at the commercial opportunities, they're very real, and I would argue incredibly compelling, right? So you look at the Wall Street consensus data points out two specific things I think of note. One is starting this year, there were two products that had in cell and gene therapy that had over $1 billion in revenue. Zolgensma, which has been approved for a number of years, and Yescarta, right? Zolgensma, I think the estimated peak revenue is to grow to 2 billion or 2.5 billion or something like that. Carvykti is supposed to become a blockbuster this year. It's J&J's CAR T therapy, and Sarepta's DMD drug, Elevidys, this year should both flip to becoming blockbusters. And then what are we going to see between now and 2030? Probably six more, right, that are coming. So some big products. And then I think even more importantly, the consensus data has 30 products between now and 2030 becoming products of over $1 billion in revenue. I call it's like ESPN. Some people are familiar with the ESPN 30 for 30. I think of it as 30 products by 2030. So, I mean, for my days, you've got a $500 million, $700 million, $900 million program. That's real revenue, right? It's not a billion, but it's a big and meaningful product. And they're for areas like we said, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, big growing market. DEB, Crystal's product for dystrophic epidermolysis bullosa, tough disorder. A number of companies working in that area. Redosable gene therapy, right? Danon disease, I mentioned from Rocket. So there's a lot of areas that are out there, and I think there's a lot of reason to believe that there is big growth opportunities in the CAR T space for liquid tumors. About 15 to 20% of eligible patients currently get access to CAR T therapies. There's a lot around, restrictions within the FDA label, things like restrictions on when you can drive, how close you have to be to a major center. Those are addressable. Those are not static. I think they'll probably get a look over the next year to two. And I think there's a lot of growth ahead of that. That's before you even get into the, other modalities like I was talking about, cell therapy for autoimmune disorders and things like that. So, and then look, there's also things that have popped up about questions about payers and, how will the commercial markets in the US, Medicaid, respond to 2 to 3, sometimes $4 million gene therapy, right? And what we're seeing is a lot like something I called out at JP Morgan, at the start of 2024, which is look, when Genzyme was out pioneering their model for Ceridase, people may remember they priced it at over $300,000 for some patients back in 1991, 92, right? They got a lot of blowback when they did that. There was like, the sky is falling, it's not going to work, it's outrageous. Well, they worked through the issues, the challenges one by one. And then what did they do? They inspired a lot of companies, the Biogens of the world, the Amgens, the Genentechs, to look at, well, okay, we can get pricing for really rough disorders if there aren't that many patients, and they kind of work through all the challenges. And I think we're seeing it's very similar to that, right? Like, the discussions today are a lot better than they were 2 to 3 years ago about, wow, how are we going to work this as more real products pull through? You hear people, well, yeah, okay, we're working through it. It's not that bad. And, I think there's a role to play for CMS. Certainly, they developed their access model for sickle cell disease, which went well, the details of which are mostly confidential, right? Only the kind of broad contours are out there, but we think it's a major step forward on modernizing a very important payer for, certainly for gene therapies and gene editing regimens. We'd like to see that potentially get scaled up. That one's been kind of passed over by the Trump administration. So they've been some cleaning out some of the CMMI projects that are out there. They've notably left that one alone today. Anything could change tomorrow, next week. We know that, but we think that's essentially a very good model, and a major step forward for modernizing how we think about payers.
Mhm. And what about the COGS component that you talked about earlier?
So say again, I had a hard time hearing you.
COGS component.
COGS.
Mhm.
Cost of goods sold. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that is an area where there's work to be done for sure. It's a little bit like, I think there are some parallels to the monoclonal antibody story, right? The cost of goods were very high, volumes low initially, a lot of challenges. The field is making progress. It probably can't move fast enough, just to be brutally candid, but there's a lot of work being done, right? Increased volume will help a lot. We're seeing that more and more in the CAR T space, certainly, right? Moving away from paper batch records will help. Automation, getting some of the humans out of the way. I'm not a person that believes AI is a magic wand, but I think it's certainly a helpful tool, and it will help and is helping in this area. So there's a lot of forces at work. There's a lot of technology being developed. We have members that are working on the next really cool widget. Won't get into which ones, but there's a number of them out there that are looking at really trying to help collapse timelines and things like that, which I think are really important. And you see some notable progress. Kite's got has had some very good Project Gilead Kite, right? Getting their COGS down. Crystal, I saw something not that long ago. Crystal Bio, which is working in DEB as an approved product, they'll get, I think, approvals in the US and Japan this year. Sorry, US is already approved. Europe and Japan are coming. They've got something like 95% gross margins for their redosable gene therapy for DEB. So, I mean, that's pretty good progress. So work to be done, but I think some areas of strength.
Progress has been made, but things continue to move in the right direction from your perspective in terms of reducing COGS and improving the automation there.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned earlier, we have seen some large pharma companies discontinue those collaborations in this space. So again, through the conversations with companies and other folks, how committed is large pharma to cell and gene therapies, and how are those trends playing out?
Yeah, I think this is one of I heard this, as I mentioned, before the recent news with Pfizer and hemophilia, right? For a long time, there was a little bit of, I would hear, Novartis is getting out of gene therapy. They're getting out of gene therapy. And they, of course, have Zolgensma, right? Big, important product. Kymriah as well, important product in the space. And then, bang, next thing you know, they bought Kate for over $1 billion, or about $1 billion, or something like that. And I just had one of their executives join our board of directors, and I can tell you they're not out of. They are investing in cell and gene therapy, right? And they're very excited about the future of a world with looking at autoimmune applications for cell therapies, right? So maybe some data helps, right? So by my count, 12 out of the 15 of the top biopharma companies are very active in our space, so 80%, call it, right? So on our board of directors alone, we've got Lilly, Novo Nordisk, Astellas, Novartis. We are of those 80% of the companies out there, we're chasing all of them. If they're not a member, they're almost all members, and if they're not, we are actively trying to sign them up and or having talks with them, right? There's a lot going on in the space, and I think they see the future of things like, as I mentioned, you know, cell therapy and autoimmune disorders, big markets, solid tumors, right? If you're into oncology and solid tumors, this is a pretty interesting place to go. For some, the gene therapy component might not be as compelling. Others, like Astellas, you know, they're all in on that stuff, and a lot of the other companies too. So Lilly's another good example, right? Building out a, you know, they just opened up a glistening new building here in Boston, and one of their executives just joined our board. They are very enthusiastic about gene therapy and gene editing.
That makes sense. I guess coming back to the question of genetic medicine versus other modalities, as you just touched on, I think one of the questions in the space has been part of it, has been on projected demand and in the context of advances in other modalities that we've seen, like biologics. I guess, how do you think about the impact of that? We've seen that in hemophilia, we've seen that in the oncology space to an extent with T-cell engagers. How do you think about that impact for the cell and gene therapy space?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, competition is just competition, right? It's really hard. And as I mentioned, I think there's some areas that are uniquely tricky, like the ultra rare model, right? So you could build with Genzyme, you could build a real business, just picking on Genzyme, right? With the 5,000 patients or whatever they had for Gaucher's population, right? And it's a recurring business, right? It's an annuity at some level, right? When I was at Biogen, we had multiple sclerosis business, which is still going, right? Um, so seeing a patient one time certainly makes that a lot trickier. And hemophilia, I think, is a good example, as I mentioned, with a lot of entrenched players. But I do think, depending on as the organizations really dig into these markets and size them, I think you find a couple of things. One, some areas with much lighter competition. I mentioned the DEB space, right? Horrible skin condition, things like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, Danon disease, right? And you're going to find other areas where there is some pretty fierce competition, certainly in oncology, right? And so it's going to be sort of product by product, market by market. It's very bespoke. In some ways, it's kind of hard to do big generalities around it. But I mean, there are a lot of diseases out there, and I think there are, again, if you're charging $2 to $4 million and you can unlock patients in the US and Europe, maybe Japan, a few other markets outside the US. It's pretty good. The other thing that's really developing that people are enthusiastic about, hasn't gotten a lot of attention because it's one of those things that's been discussed for about a decade, but not a ton of progress was made, was the idea of platform technologies, right? So the idea of, for example, if you've got just go back to traditional CRISPR-Cas9, right? You've got the nuclease, you've got the guide RNA, you've done a lot of work, you've gotten your IND cleared. Maybe there's, call it, 2,000 to 3,000 patients you could address between the US and Europe, say, right? Well, now you go for a close cousin disease, you're just swapping out the guide RNA. Everything else remains the same, right? Do you have to go all the way back to step one and recreate every study that you've ever done as if you've never learned anything? Or how much can you reference from your earlier work, your earlier IND? And we pick one topic a year where we work with the FDA. They pick the topic, actually. We float a few, and we call it our ARM FDA Scientific Exchange. We spent a day working with them on it, and they picked gene editing as a platform last November. And we went really deep on it. We brought in case studies from Berkeley, the Broad Institute, Penn, and then a number of organizations just on this, locking on this topic. Exactly how could you try to make this a reality with the FDA. And they announced in, I think it was early January, they were going to put together guidance this year to try to enable that, which I think is very meaningful. Because suddenly you could look and say, all right, well, we could do one IND, take a few years, spend a few $1 million, get that cleared and go pursue, as I mentioned, 2,000 to 3,000 patients. But what if we looked at 3 or 4 other related disorders where we're just going to swap out the guide RNA? Now we might have 10,000 patients or 7,000 patients, right, and kind of related diseases. So that should hopefully drive timelines, help with competition, allow for greater efficiencies, et cetera. It's a small thing, but it's an interesting glimpse of how you can think about industrializing the field to get costs down, unlock different commercial markets,
Mm.
and drive a lot of other yeah, look, importantly, make a big difference on patients with rare disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. That should be interesting as we get more guidance on that. So I guess staying on the regulatory topic, as you mentioned, we've been in a favorable regulatory environment in the US for the past couple of years for the cell and gene therapy space. We're now obviously in a transition period with the new government administration that's implementing several policy changes, as well as changes in leadership at government agencies that interface with biotech. So what's your take on the recent developments, and how do you think about the impact for genetic medicines, both positive and negative?
Yeah, so kind of high level and then specific areas within the transition. Yeah, so we have spent a lot of time since the before the election, since the election in the last several weeks, right, looking at this stuff. And look, it to put it mildly, a disruptive force is kind of wind is blown into Washington, D.C. Everybody can kind of see that by design, right? That's part of what the Trump administration was. It's not by accident. They said they were going to disrupt some stuff, shake some stuff up, right? And so there's been a lot of ink spilled focusing on this. I talked about this a little bit at J.P. Morgan earlier this year. I guess I somewhat accurately said there is going to be a lot written about this, and some of it's going to be the sky is falling. And the trick is, I think, we always talk about internally, you got to tease out the sort of what's real and what's being written and being discussed. Because I can tell you some specific examples where it's like, well, this person left because the Trump administration came in from the FDA, and we knew for a fact that person had already resigned in December. Like, so there's a lot of that going on, which at some level is very understandable, right? Busy, really time of the year. And I am not Pollyannish, believe me. We try to take a very clear-eyed view and balance things out on this. But I do think we talk a lot within our community, within our board of you got to look at things pretty objectively and look at the challenges and the opportunities and go get after them and think about not just playing defense, but think about playing offense in a lot of areas. And I remind people that, every administration has their challenges and opportunities. The Biden team, when they were in, I heard it from board members, right? The price controls from the IRA, high interest rates, and aggressive FTC. We had a really brutal 3 years for the markets, right? It's not by accident, right? I just last week had a meeting with HHS Secretary Kennedy. I put together a small meeting, probably about 20 of us total in the room. And while I wouldn't want to get into lots of the specific details, I could say they spent an hour with us. They asked excellent questions. I heard a clear support for cell and gene therapy right out of the box, sort of a how can we help, how can we work together, which was extremely welcome. I walked away much more comforted than when I went into the meeting. I'd characterize it as a very good meeting. And I think that helps with the tone around the FDA, with CMS, with NIH. Again, I'm not Pollyannish. There's going to be bumps in the road for sure, but that was a good one. The FDA specifically, again, a lot written about it. We're in regular contact with senior folks at the FDA. We think very, very highly of Peter Marks and Nicole Verdun. Nicole runs the Office of Therapeutic Products. Peter, of course, runs CBER. I mentioned I think right now with OTP, it's like you don't always see it in the moment. It's the golden era from a regulatory perspective. I think the differences that they've made in the past 18 months to 2 years have been transformative. They're using accelerated approval as a very effective tool. I think I don't remember the exact number, something like 5 or 6 accelerated approvals in the last 6, 7 months of 2024. I think there might have been 3 total before that. Peter's talked about using that more and more. He has. We hear very favorable things from our board members about, Nicole Verdun will jump on calls to help roll up her sleeves and help review INDs. Rachel Anatol, her deputy as well, very active, very constructive, asking the right questions. helping more junior reviewers understand what's relevant to clearing an IND, what's not. So, hands-on and important. Um, Marty McCary just got confirmed, I think it was yesterday. Sorry, not confirmed. He got voted out of the Senate Help Committee. Two Democrats voted for him, 14-9 vote, right? Getting stability into the FDA, getting a commissioner in there, I think will help a lot. Scott Gottlieb is obviously a very well known, very well regarded in our space commissioner. We're hopeful Marty McCary will be in that vein. And that also helps stabilize the existing team, A, and B, when stuff does perhaps come out of the White House or OMB, the budget office within the executive branch, that people can then intervene and say, well, here's how I'm going to interpret it, right? Like, or I might need to exempt certain things. So we're hopeful that that'll work. That'll work much better.
That's encouraging to hear. And then how are you thinking about the ex-US piece of the puzzle? What trends have you noticed on the regulatory and the reimbursement side? And any other trends that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, regulatory's been pretty steady and stable, right? The feedback, again, you roll back the clock 2 years ago, the feedback I used to always get 2, 3 years ago was, the EMA is doing a great job. They understand the science. They have much lower turnover than the FDA. There's stability when you show up on calls, they're prepared. I think I mentioned Emer Cook's going to come to our conference in a few weeks. I'll know more after that. I will say from my conversations with them, they're very enthusiastic about the field and see this as a really important area. On the health technology assessment front, I think, headwinds and tailwinds, probably a bit like what people see in biotech all the time. The challenges are have been well documented. There's countries or regions within countries that deliver healthcare that say, hey, I have a fixed budget and here's how many CAR-T patients I can take in this region in Italy, for example, right? So you've got things that are very kind of specific and challenging at times. Clearly, some of the health technology assessment bodies are not the biggest fans of single arm trials, right? So that's come up. There is there's a bigger effort out of Brussels right now that's gone into place on called the Joint Clinical Assessment. So they're reviewing all oncology products and all cell and gene therapy products through a centralized review process out of Brussels. We've been very involved in trying to ensure that goes as well as possible because we're going to be living with it for the foreseeable future. I would say 12 months ago, I was more disturbed at how that was going. It's gotten much better, and there's certainly a lot of countries that are working through these issues effectively and efficiently. So I think that's gone well. And then again, a big thing is real products are a forcing function, right? Like, how do you want to deal with this? And companies roll up their sleeves, put shoulder to the wheel, and work through them. CSL Bearings, I think, doing a very good job rolling through a number of countries for their hemophilia product, and there are other good examples. And then I think it's also sometimes it's the actual product and the patient communities, right? It's really hard to push back on some of these. That some of these products have a very, very compelling value proposition for patients for whom the status quo will represent death or serious disability. So.
No, absolutely. Okay, that's also encouraging. So you guys have been pretty stable and things are being incorporated there to potentially centralize and streamline some of the factors there. Great. And I guess one of the other trends that we've seen in recent months has been that of large pharma looking to China for licensing and assets, for example, at a discount. How do you think this trend could impact the cell and gene therapy space from your perspective?
Yeah, and I'm not the biggest expert on China, so I don't want to oversell that. You do hear it though, right? They can move products quickly. They can get into the clinic quickly. They can move through trials fast. You know, spend less money doing it. There's always questions about the quality. What's the data? How much data can be used in the U.S., right? I think there are a lot of questions, but there's certainly something there. And Big Pharma, as you know, has taken a look at some of these products and is interested in them, right? And how could it? there's plus and minuses, right? Like that could put some pressure on some companies in the US for sure. On the other hand, you might see more companies licensing in technology that could be very helpful, right? Then they run the US trial, the European trial, a global trial, whatever. And that could be terrific news for the patients that are involved, right? But I think there's a lot of sifting through the technology and trying to find those rare gems that is hard and laborious, but a lot of the large pharmaceutical companies have had long time businesses in China, and so it's very real. There are other things out there that are just X factors. I just don't know how are they going to play out things like biosecure and things like that. That would less impact an asset that you're licensing in more companies, right? But it's certainly a very challenging time on the one hand with China tariffs, Biosecure Act, lots of things sloshing around on the one hand. On the other hand, they have real science and real assets, and that's meaningful, important. So it's kind of there's a lot going on in China from a macro perspective that is very complex and is not going to go away, when we turn the calendar into 2026. But there's some real products there. So I see kind of both ends of it.
Makes sense. Maybe coming back to the reasons to be optimistic, we touched on this a little bit, but can you kind of delineate your thinking on why why we should be optimistic on the space, in particular in terms of addressing the challenges that we talked about, and what you're excited about with respect to the next wave of genetic medicines and how they're incorporating some of the learnings and the challenges that the current wave has had to overcome.
Yeah, so reasons to believe, right? Yeah, I think, again, I think the tip of the spear is the science, as I indicated. I think you look at epigenetic editing, you look at base editing and prime editing, and right, there's a lot going on, maybe stating the obvious, right? Obviously, the financial headwinds have put pressure on real companies. They've thinned out their pipelines, right? We'd love to see even more in the global pipeline, but there's a lot there. In the cell therapy space, I articulated that already. So I think that's super important. I am probably more hopeful than many that the given where we are with the FDA today, how well it's going, that they'll get passed over from a lot of the kind of rougher scrutiny. I might be wrong about that, but I am hopeful that is the case. I also think there's been some, while the financial markets have been tough for the last few years, even this quarter, we've seen some rewarding of some either strong early science or some data, right? So we had four raises that I count this quarter that were over $100 million, right? So we had Umoja with a $100 million raise. They're working on in vivo CAR Ts. Tune had a Series B of $175 million epigenetic editing, right? Solid Bio had very strong early but strong data on Duchenne muscular dystrophy, $200 million raise, and Beam just a few days ago, right, had good data on AATD, $500 million raise, right? So clearly there's sign, and there's a bunch that are, 90, $70 million. Some are private and haven't come out yet. Some are more public. So there's money out there. It's hard, and there's companies that are struggling, and if you don't have much cash, it's obviously hard to raise cash, right? There's a lot of that normal stuff that's kind of going through, but there's still been some impressive raises, I think. So that's a little bit of a sense of the reward, and I would take that as helpful signs given again some of the bigger macro question marks that are out there. So I think when you add up where the regulatory science is, with the science that's kind of coming through in the pipelines, areas like I mentioned, gene editing as a platform, I think that could be really interesting future areas of growth. And then again, I go back to the commercialization piece. I think that's been a really underreported, underwritten tale. And I think that, some of we're probably in a show me kind of mindset right now, given some of the setbacks in the field. But four products, this year likely to be blockbuster status is pretty good. And I think the growth, I mentioned my 30 for 30. I think it's a good one to watch.
And so earlier you mentioned kind of parallels to the monoclonal antibody space. So can you talk a little bit about how you envision that being reflected in the growth of the genetic medicine space going forward?
Sorry, you broke up for 1 second. Was it monoclonal antibodies? Is that what you?
Antibodies, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's one that I was at Biogen and we did the the tie-up with IDEC. Um, so I heard a lot about the struggles of monoclonal antibodies once upon a time, right? So the Rituxan story, right? So you saw in the 1990s. First of all, I think it's starting in the 1970s. The first monoclonal antibodies are kind of being built, right? Took many years to kind of come along. In the 1990s, there were some notable setbacks. And then Rituxan came along, I forget the exact year, 97, 98, something like that. It gets approved, right, for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But right before that, I mean, I remember I used to report up into Bill Rastetter, who was the longtime CEO and chair of IDEC, and then was the executive chair of Biogen, and he'd be like, Tim, you have no idea. Nobody in their right mind wanted to go anywhere near a monoclonal antibody for cancer. I could not. He was like, I'm flying all over the world. I'm going to Japan. I'm flying everywhere, trying to strike any kind of a deal while IDEC is running out of money. And I remember him saying, I had the breakup papers to the company in my briefcase. I drove to work with it every day. I think the CFO resigned. He was like, there's like we were almost at like the no hope phase, and then they obviously cut this famous deal with Genentech and gets the product approved in again 97 or 98, and within like 3 years it's a blockbuster product, right? $1 billion product. Remicade came along from J&J, right? So I think the bigger thing is these markets are nonlinear, right? What's monoclonal antibody market today is 250 billion-dollar market, right? Something like that. And obviously there's a lot in cancer, right? So it's a little bit of do the products work? Can you get them approved? How do the regulators look at them? Can you make them efficiently? Like it's to the cost of goods. Can you sell them? US, Europe, other major markets. I think there are, any of these parallels are imperfect, but I think there are some there. And I also think, a lot of the challenges that people point to and that I've discussed today are, they're just a tale of biotech, right? People think, wow, it must always have been easy to get products paid for in Europe, at times, right? Some of the traditional biologics. It was a slog, right? Like when I was at Biogen, they were like, it's like breaking rocks in the hot sun, trying to figure out each one of these markets. Well, it's a lot easier in some ways today than it was when you're first pioneering these things. I mentioned Genzyme and Cerazime, work, right? It's a lot of you're building and pioneering a new field, and you do it with a product and a company and another product and another company, and reimbursement today in the U.S. through commercial payers and Medicaid is better than it was, than it looked a few years ago, and it'll get better in a few more years. And I think that's also the case with Europe. Again, the stuff's hard. I'm not saying it's a slam dunk, but real products are a forcing function, and that I think helps. Does that
Mhm.
answer your question?
Yeah, got it. And I guess from your perspective, you're confident that the US systems will be able to handle these additional products coming onto the market.
I think they will. I mean, I think value-based pricing helps a lot, right? That's at the crux of the CMMI access model that I mentioned. It's really how do you enable value-based pricing arrangements through Medicaid, right? So Medicaid's probably 50%, maybe a little bit north of that, of the rare disease population. The addressable gene therapy, gene editing regimens will go through Medicaid primarily, right? And that's where the CMMI access model looks at like, hey, can we round up a number of different states? Presumably these are small to mid-sized states, have them in one basket, it's a voluntary arrangement with the biotech company where you basically cut a deal, probably give something. It's all confidential, but the assumption is give a little bit on pricing to get greater volume. And then the idea is CMMI will collect the data and will essentially administer the value-based pricing arrangement to try to make sure the metrics have been hit in this case, it's sickle cell disease, right? are the patients getting better? Are they staying out of the hospital? What have you, right? And again, we think that's an important one. Again, if it works well, you could see it scaling potentially up to many other markets. And it's just an efficiency tool. A lot of these small Medicaid programs, they can't administer a value-based arrangement, right? What they've done today is they've just said we can't, even if some companies offer them, they'll say we can't run, so we'll just pay it out, just pay the patient, right? So there are real world challenges. If you have a qualified treatment center somewhere, if your child's going to go to, say, Boston Children's Hospital, and there isn't another big medical center nearby, and you live in Maine or Vermont or New Hampshire, and you're in Medicaid, right? There are challenges, logistical challenges around. You've got to get the state of Maine or Vermont or New Hampshire has to qualify the physician doing the work, right? So there's paperwork stuff that can take some time and be a little bit laborious. We're looking at legislation to try to kind of push down some of those little micro barriers, because they can become real, and it's bipartisan. We're hopeful that could go through. The administration could do some of those things unilaterally, which would be great too. They may have the authority to do it on their own. We're encouraging that. Um, but yeah, it's not that there aren't some challenges, but there's a lot, I think, of positive things that are out there. And a lot of the commercial payers, there was one blurb I saw not long ago that, I think it was one of the Blue Cross programs was like, well, we're not going to necessarily cover products that have accelerated approvals or will take some time. We think that's a very, very bad idea. I know the FDA thinks that's a very, very bad idea, and approval's an approval. And time is the enemy for some of these patients. So I think that's an area that we'll keep an eye on a little bit more. We don't do a lot in the commercial space, but our members certainly are very active there. And you want to ensure these patients get these medicines that they need in a timely manner and not with a lot of delays.
Maybe in the last few minutes, wanted to give you an opportunity to give advice for people that are following this space. What is your advice for companies, investors, all of us who've been following the trials and tribulations here?
Yeah, I'd say put a discount on some of the headlines you read, some of the rumors, some of the myths. I would really interrogate some of the basics issues that are out there. The commercial, the two that pop up are, the commercialization challenges and the as I mentioned, the large pharmaceutical companies are not involved in the space. If they weren't involved in the space, it would be a bigger problem. The fact that they're in it and they seem to have a great, they have some near-term interest, but a long-term view, I think is super helpful. So I would discount some of that stuff. And two, I would really like measure twice and cut once on these macro challenges that are going on allegedly within the Trump administration. Again, I'm not Pollyannish. There are some real issues that are going on, but it's worth, doing the homework on that, because I think, again, I'm hopeful that when Marty Makary gets in, and I think he will get in on a comfortable vote, he will have a positive impact on the agency. I think those are two. And then the other one is I'd keep an eye on the science, because I think the science, it is breathtaking. Some of the things that can be done today that couldn't be done 5 years ago and 10 years ago for sure. And I think that, as I mentioned, we're seeing that with companies introducing data that's very positive, turning around, raising, in case I gave 4 examples of over $100 million, and a lot that are just below that. I think it's impressive. It's also been a time where there's been a lot of purging of the field, right? So you never know when you hit bottom, but 3 years into a bigger downdraft in biotech, maybe we're there. It's hard to know, but certainly the science is pretty amazing. And I think the fact that the regulators have been so constructive and helpful is, as I called it, a bit of a golden era with the regulators that I think it's important to appreciate. I was in the antibiotic space many years ago when I was at Cubist, and when I walked in the door around 2011, it was like our CEO was pulling his hair out because he was fighting with the regulators at every step of the way. That is not what you see in cell and gene therapy. They are partners at working through the science on behalf of patients, which is really great.
We did have an audience question going back to one of the topics that we touched on earlier regarding the interest of patients or doctors in prescribing medications in indications where there is available but non-curative therapy. What do you see as the factors that drive hesitancy among patients and doctors to take up some of these recently approved therapies and indications like hemophilia and sickle cell?
Yeah. Well, generally, let me start at the beginning, which is even in clinical trials, like what's the patient journey like, or oftentimes what's the caregiver journey like, right? The parents, for example, right? One of the challenges, and this gets to kind of small e ethical challenges, is okay, you're running a gene therapy clinical trial, and you're in the clinic for the first time, and you're gonna do sort of dose ranging, and you're gonna, a parent could be thinking, okay, well, if my child gets something that's the low dose and it's safe but it doesn't work, can they get redosed? Right? Well, oftentimes no, right? Usually. Okay, well, should I wait for something else? Like, is this going to be my one-time shot at it? And if that's the case, whether that's a child, parent thinking about a child in a clinical trial, until it's clear what is the safety profile, what's the efficacy, what's the durability, right? There can understandably be some hesitation because you can't just necessarily switch to the next thing, right? Then that kind of ladders up into then other areas, right? Like, okay, well, for hemophilia or for sickle cell, like, okay, is this my best shot if I've got one, or should I wait? And a lot of that is very patient and disease specific, right? Like, what's the specific patient that is in front of me? If you're a clinician, how much time do they have, right? I think one of the, like with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, as I mentioned, Sarepta's product is a real and big product, right? These patients don't have a lot of time. And there is Solid, and there's other companies, Regenex, others are working in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but they're going to be a few years behind. And so I think that there's a calculus that parents are doing that I don't necessarily have time with my child. So I think that's a big thing. That is different than you'll see in some other areas. I think hemophilia is one. Wow, I got a lot of options. Yeah, maybe I've got acute bleeds, right? These gene therapies are really, in this case, like for patients with acute bleeds, right? These are patients that consume 8, 9, 10 more, 15 more, 20 million dollars worth of lifetime healthcare costs, right? These are the rough patients, not the well-managed patients, right? It's the tail. Do they wait? There's some, we've heard some stories about, hey, look, people that are in the community have been through a lot, right? They went through the HIV crisis together, right? Sort of part of their identity. I've talked to a number of sickle cell patients that talk about after I got treated. This includes Victoria Gray, who I've met on a number of occasions, and a few others, Jimmy Olahair, who were like, it's different once you're treated, because it's like I feel like I don't have sickle cell anymore. I've only known a world in which that is a huge part of my identity. So there is a lot of complex factors that can go into it, and the sickle cell regimens are not easy, right? They're not. They take time. They're complex. That journey is not one you take lightly. You probably need to think about it, talk to your family. People did say to a number of patients I've talked to, like, I spent a lot of time praying on it. Is this the right time for me to do this or not? I got to take time off from work or school or my family, and it's a lot of complexity.
That makes sense. It sounds like the fact that it's specific to the disease as well as specific to the therapy in terms of the clinical profile that we've seen for it, as well as specific to the patient in terms of what's right in their life.
Yes. Yes. It's very bespoke. Yep.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think we're just about at time here. So I'd like to thank you again, Tim, for the fantastic discussion.
Great to be here, Gula. Thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.